Hello, everyone. Welcome to East Asia Institute's online seminar, America After the Election. I'm Yul Sohn, President of EAI and Yonsei University professor. I'm excited to host today's seminar as the beginning of our 4 consecutive webinar series titled After Trump. The themes include U.S.-Korea cooperation under great power rivalry, ROC-U.S. alliance and its future under the new administration, and economic partnership under the great economic decoupling. This one also is a sequel to our previous webinar held in May this year. So it was 6 months ago, the title Prospects for the Upcoming U.S. Election. Today we are featuring the same panelists as before, Professors Paul Pierson, Taeku Lee, and Byoung Sohn. I'm actually thrilled to have all them back because their predictions made 6 months ago are very, very accurate. They said that Trump is clearly underdog, Biden wins, Trump might not concede. Existing forecasting models are most likely fail, and COVID elections, etc. So it's truly a great gathering again. For our first speaker, Paul Pierson is the John Gross Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He is an active commentator on public affairs whose writings appear in various places, including New York Times, Washington Post, and New Republic. He is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Let Them Eat Twits, How the Rights Rule in the Age of Extreme Inequality, very interesting topic, title. And he has many prize-winning books, including Politics in Time, Dismantling the Welfare State, etc. And his article, I think it came out a long time ago, Past Dependence, Increasing Returns, and the Study of Politics, is a must-read, article to every, graduate students in political science. So, very famous work. And our second speaker is Professor Taeku Lee, who is the George Johnson Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He has hands-on experience with surveys and elections. He is a co-principal investigator of the National Asian American Survey, co-principal investigator of the Bay Area Poverty Tracker, and managing director of Asian American Decisions. He also serves on the National Advisory Committee for the U.S. Census Bureau, and he previously served as a member of the Board of Overseers of the American National Election Studies, and member of the Board of Overseers of the General Social Survey, as well as Treasurer and Executive Council member for the American Political Science Association, long list. And his research obviously focused on the racial and ethnic politics and public opinion and survey research, etc. So, and his recent publications include Oxford Handbook of Racial and Ethnic Politics in the United States and Asian American Political Participation. With that, today's discussant is Professor Kwon of Chung-Ang University, who is a leading scholar in the field of American politics in Korea. He has published many books, including Climate Change and Dilemma for the U.S. Hegemony, and Is the United States Congressional Politics Still a Model to Follow? The U.S. Congress Captured by the Partisan Politics, etc. Today's format, webinar format, is that it is divided into 3. So first, maybe first round, we will discuss elections, past elections. And the second round will be what comes next for the Biden presidency. And finally, we'll have Q&A section from the audience. Actually, we have a long list of questions from the audience. And I just oversee it, and there are very interesting questions there. So I will introduce them to you. So with that said, for the first round, let's start with the election. Given the Trump presidency actually damaging the United States inside and outside, this election, 2020 election, is in a sense, a watershed, and probably the most consequential since World War II, or some may say since Civil War. So let me first, ask, Paul, and then Taeku, what's your takeaways from this election? Paul?
Thank you, Yul. It's great to be back in this conversation with you. And I was planning on starting with what you finished with, which is, I think it is right to say the most consequential election since at least World War II, but arguably you could go back even further than that. And so the fact that we're saying that, I think, is indicative of how deep the structural challenges are facing the United States today and how deep the divide is. And so rather than going into too much detail about all the twists and turns of the campaign and the election, I wanted to start by just framing it by imagining three possible outcomes that could have come about on Tuesday, which each seemed plausible, and each, I think, would have had very different consequences. We'll get into the more details of the consequences in the second part now that we, I think, know where we are, which path we're on. But I think we can really understand things best by thinking about the three alternatives. So the first would be President Trump being reelected. And even though Joe Biden won the popular vote by, it looks like, ultimately it'll probably be 4 or 5%. It was close enough in the Electoral College that you don't have to imagine all that many votes switching hands to imagine a world in which President Trump was reelected. And if we had been on that path, I don't think it would be alarmist to say we would have been continuing down the path of Democratic backsliding, what Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have called Democratic backsliding in their book, How Democracies Die, because there has been a steady erosion of the guardrails of democracy in American society during the Trump presidency. And with 4 more years to fill the courts, to fill the national security and law enforcement apparatuses, to launch assaults on the media, I think, and without the shadow of an impending election hanging over him, I think we could certainly have expected that we would have seen the continuing slippage of democracy that you've seen in some other countries like Hungary or Brazil or Poland to have taken place in the United States. The second possible outcome was, what we call here the blue wave scenario, in which I think, many pollsters anticipated, and maybe we'll want to talk a little bit about the polling. But a blue wave election, which would have involved a big Democratic victory with a clear repudiation of the Trump presidency and a substantial enough victory in the Senate to give Democrats at least a small but working majority in the Senate, that would have put us on a very different path. It would have opened up at least some prospects for significant political and social reform. The Biden, the president-elect, had talked about his plans, recognizing that he was going to be in a kind of New Deal kind of situation. Biden himself, I think, pretty moderate, but seeing that this was going to be a moment for aggressive reforms. And whether you're talking about climate change, or dealing with the pandemic or the kinds of political reforms that would address, I think, some really deep dysfunctions in the American political system, like the existence of the filibuster, which makes it very difficult to legislate. So the second path would have been the blue wave path. We got neither of those paths in the election. We're on the third path, which involved, I think, a clear defeat of President Trump. You know, the election results in both the Electoral College and the popular vote are clear. Biden is ahead in the Electoral College. In some ways, it's kind of the mirror image of what happened in 2016. Same likely Electoral College vote count, though with somewhat larger margins in the critical states than was true when Hillary Clinton was defeated by Donald Trump. And then a clearer popular vote majority, of course. But we'll probably have to get into this. There is discussion about fraud and so on. There is no evidence of any significant irregularities in the election. This is something, these accusations in many ways, I think, are completely predictable given the nature of the man in the White House. But the electoral result was clear, although there is likely to be a fair amount of noise around it in the weeks to come. But Democrats did not capture the Senate. They still could if they win both of the runoff elections that will be held in the state of Georgia in early January. They will not be favorites to win those races, I think it's fair to say. And we will be in a very different situation if they are or are not able to win those races. Because if they are not, which I think, again, is more likely, then Republicans will continue to hold majority control in the very powerful US Senate, which means that President Biden essentially will not be able to pass legislation unless it is acceptable to the majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, and will not be able to appoint judges unless the Republican Senate majority is willing to let him do that. And they may let him appoint a few, and judges matter tremendously in the American institutional framework. So we got a mixed result. Which is, and although there's, I think, understandably enormous focus on the fact that President Trump is going to have to leave office, we need to recognize that it is a mixed result and that it leaves the United States continuing to be in the world that it has been in now for really, I think one could argue almost a quarter century. Of very deep divides between the parties, and with the parties being quite evenly matched, both presidential candidates received more votes than any presidential candidate has received in American political history, right? Which indicates that both sides were really able to mobilize their supporters, and the outcome was a pretty close thing. So I can get into this more and then maybe in the next round of the discussion, but the American political system is prone to gridlock the way the system is designed. And it encourages, particularly, I would say, the Conservative Party, which is less committed to the idea of having government actually function. It encourages that party to engage in ways that that threaten the legitimacy of the system and make it as difficult as possible for the government to function well. So it's very much a mixed outcome, even though you see hundreds of thousands of people celebrating in the streets, and I think with reason for those who are concerned about the health of democracy. The next few years are likely to continue to be quite difficult ones.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Kind of pessimistic evaluation. One quick follow-up question. You said the highest turnout in the U.S. history, right? This election. How that actually played out in the race? Is it for Biden or for Trump? Do you have any analysis of that turnout?
Well, so it's the highest turnout in 100 years as a percentage, I think, of those eligible to vote. But just numerically, the highest turnout ever. In part because the population has grown and there are a lot more people who are eligible to vote. But I think it was a case where both sides really mobilized their voters. And I mean, we can talk. Taeku is much better positioned to talk about this than I am, about some of the changes around the edges that are interesting, people who maybe switch sides or where there was disproportionate growth. But I think the overall story is that both sides really got their voters out. And if there was anything surprising there, if folks watching were following the lead up to the campaign, I think pollsters expected, on average, a bigger victory than Biden got. They were looking for him to win by maybe 8 or 9 points, where it looks like it'll end up being something like 5. And my sense of that is that the biggest mistake there was, once again, as happened in 2016, underestimating the capacity of Donald Trump to get out small town and rural voters who are sometimes not regular voters, but they came out to vote for Donald Trump.
Thank you, Paul. I think yes, Taeku, it's your turn. Tell us more about the election, particularly just last point of Paul, that there's still a discrepancy between polls, forecasting and the actual result. The gap is 3-4% overall, and how do we explain that? So, including that question, it's your turn.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you again, President Sohn and East Asia Institute, for the opportunity to bring us back to recap the 2020 elections. A lot has happened since May, and so it's a pleasure and honor to be invited back to take stock of the past half year. I'm going to get to the question of polling at the end, because it'll require a little bit of getting into the weeds. But I think first, in terms of analyzing the election results, I would start where I ended my part of the presentation back in May, where I ended by saying that, it's not clear in 2020 that democracy would be the only game in town, where the only thing the losers would want to do is to try again within the same institutions under which they had just lost, which is a famous description of stable, consolidated democracies. And that there were specifically 4 possible outcomes. Trump wins and the Democrats accept the outcome. Trump wins and the Democrats refuse to accept the outcome. Biden wins and Trump accepts the outcome, or Biden wins and Trump refuses to accept the outcome. And by now it is clear that Biden has won, but it is far from clear that Trump will accept the outcome. And if he does not accept the outcome, what that means for whether we are still a functioning democracy, and what that means in terms of governance for the United States. Now, to be realistic, it is still, I think, more likely than not that Trump will have to accept the outcome once his litany of legal challenges, which have so far been facially meritless, have run their course. And when that happens, it may well be the case that the dark clouds over our democracy for the last 3 or 4 years will lift, and the US as a government, if not as a people, will awake from this sort of long period of bewitchment under the Trump presidency and return to some semblance of pre-Trump normalcy, where I think you can maybe again think of the United States as aspiring to return to its standing as global leader, staunch ally, reliable trade partner, and a force for positive change on problems requiring multilateral solutions like climate change and the future and the threat of future pandemics. I think that is still the likely road ahead, but it is still possible that we won't go down that likely road. And a lot still depends on how deep and resolute Trump's support among voters is, or, you know, it's hard to even think in these terms, or what fraction of his voters are militant and militarized. And much still depends on whether institutions like the Republican Party and its leaders and the conservative media and its spokespersons put the cult of personality that is Trump ahead of the nation's 233-year history as a constitutional electoral democracy. And, you know, here I'm of the same mind as Paul that so far distressingly few national leaders of the Republican Party have even acknowledged the legitimacy of the 2020 election, despite there being no shred of evidence to suggest that the election is not legitimate. Then in terms of analysis of the outcomes itself, I think there are at least two key stories to the outcome, one of which you have undoubtedly heard a lot about and Paul has mentioned as well, and that is the story of turnout. The other key to the outcome is one that I think is still relatively less talked about, or talked about in terms that I think are misleading, and that is the story of race. The turnout story is clear and to an extent uncomplicated. A record number of Americans voted by mail, voted early, voted on election day. And when the final tally is reported, we'll see that nearly 150 million Americans will have voted, or 2 out of every 3 Americans eligible to vote. And as Paul mentioned, that's going to be the highest proportion of voter eligible Americans to have voted since the early 20th century. What we're learning from the vote count is that this record turnout is the result of mobilization on both sides of the campaign. So Trump is on target to get 9 million more total votes than he did in 2016. And Biden is on target to get 11 million more total votes than Hillary Clinton did in 2020. So this last weekend, you may have seen, you know, even in Korea, accounts of hundreds of thousands of Americans spilling into the streets in festive celebration of Biden's electoral victory. And in mainstream media, with the exception of Fox News, I think one repeated theme in the coverage of these celebrations was that American voters, without shedding a drop of blood, had ousted a authoritarian ruler in the making, using just the power of the popular vote. And when the dust settles and all the votes are finally tallied, I think one side, Biden-Harris, will have received 5 million more votes than the other side. So that's all to the good to an extent. But I think we still have to keep in mind that the ouster of authoritarian rulers, or wannabe authoritarian rulers, which I think is a fair characterization of Donald Trump, often takes more than one election. And in the key respect of the Electoral College vote, I think the 2020 outcome was remarkably close still. So the total vote margin is going to wind up being about 5 million, and that's a huge number. But if you just pull off 1% of that total vote margin, 50,000 votes, and you distribute that selectively across Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, you would have had an entirely different outcome in terms of the Electoral College vote in 2020. And we could instead be here talking about what another 4 years of a Trump-Pence presidency means for the United States, for Korea, and for the world. I mentioned that the second story of the 2020 election is a story about racial division in America, and that this story is either buried behind the lead or covered in misleading ways. So let me say a little bit about that. To start with, the US was already divided by race before Donald Trump ascended to the presidency, but it is clear that he has deepened those divisions with his rhetoric and with his policies. Trump may not have invented racial polarization or white supremacist movements, but he has unmistakably fanned their flames. The exit polls show clearly that Biden-Harris won because a coalition of Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American voters coalesced to deliver the White House for the Democrats. And in polling that I've conducted along with pollsters who specialize in targeted representative samples of Latinos and African Americans, we find 89% of Blacks, 70% of Latinos, 68% of Asian Americans voted for Biden and Harris. And by contrast, only 41% of whites voted for Biden and Harris. Moreover, had Trump and Pence been reelected, it would have been because a solid majority, 56%, of white voters were fine with further Democratic backsliding. They would have been fine with a descent into authoritarian rule, and they would have been fine with reelecting a president who dog whistled to white supremacists. If you follow the news from the US on race and the 2020 vote, I think what you'll read is a lot about conservative Latinos in Miami-Dade County and along the Rio Grande in Texas. You'll probably read a little bit about rap music artists like Kanye West and Ice Cube trying to mobilize the African-American male vote in greater numbers for Donald Trump in 2016. Then in 2020 than they did in 2016. But you almost surely won't read many stories about the fact that there was this enormous coalition of voters of color. I think what you see in the news misses the forest for the trees. The margins favoring Biden over Trump in these demographic groups remain very, very high. Plus, the turnout grew enormously in 2020. And because of that combination, high margins and voter turnout, Biden won. On the other side, I think if you follow the news, you'll see a lot of pundits and pollsters who will go on at length. They did before the election, and many have since Tuesday, about the key role that different demographic segments of white voters may have played in the success of Biden's victory, focusing on white women, white college-educated voters, white suburban voters, white young voters, and what they have yet to unearth in election results and exit polls is that Biden and Harris did not win a majority of the counted votes in any of these demographic subgroups of white voters. So they won 43% of the white female vote, 49% of the college-educated white vote, 46% of the suburban white vote, 46% of the 18 to 29-year-old white vote. So the racial division in the American electorate really, I think, determined the partisan outcome in the election. Now, in terms of polls and whether or not polls raised expectations in terms of the final vote count, I think Paul is onto one key part of the story, which is that there's sort of a mismatch in terms of pre-election polls between their predictions for the likely outcomes in national elections, which remain pretty good, and the extent to which they have missed their call in state level elections, which sometimes they've missed really badly. Part of it is because it is really hard to include certain segments of the American population into surveys. But part of the reason why that is the technology of polling in the United States has increasingly shifted towards list-based polling, online polling, and polling which is not based on representativeness, but based on targeted quotas. Meaning when people, especially in states, are trying to get what they would call a representative sample, let's say of Texans, they only focus on trying to get 20% Latinos, 50% women, 24% 18 to 29-year-olds. And once they hit those targets, they'll claim to be representative. But the methodology for getting people in those numbers, in those different demographic groups, is not the same as representative random sampling. And so when you do that and you're very reliant on lists, you have to ask who is not likely to be on a lot of these vendor lists that parties are using and that mainstream media sources are using And it tends to be people like rural voters, the hard to reach voters that Trump was very successful in mobilizing in 2016 and in 2020. So I think there are some systematic sources of bias in the way pollsters have been doing their work. And it's not easy to think about how they might get more accurate, especially at the state level, based on the way that they're conducting these polls.
All right, thank you, Taeku. Let's invite Byoung Sohn. I think he's an election expert, so he has questions to you. So.
I'm very happy to see you all again, and this is a great honor for me to join this discussion. And, I heard from all of you that this election was no landslide victory for Biden, and it's so-called razor-thin election. And as Professor Taeku said, it's, and also Paul Pierson said, this election is, an election of deep division in terms of parties, in terms of ideology, in terms of, race. And we learned a lot from what you have talked so far. And I have several questions one question to each, of you after listening to your presentation. The first thing is that, as we know that the focal point of this election, to my reading, is that whether Democratic candidate Biden can take again the blue world three states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. That was the first focal point in this election, to my mind. And he finally succeeded in getting them back. But the margin was very, very, close. At least, particularly in Pennsylvania. Michigan the margin was pretty big. Given that, can we say that, the blue collar workers in those three blue states, they, what are they? What are their stance? For example, we cannot say that they crossed the point of no return to the Democratic Party. Or, if we had a stronger candidate than this Biden, can a stronger or more popular candidate, would have gained more support from those blue collar candidates? Or, we now can no more say that, the blue collar, the blue world is no more the bulwark of the Democratic Party. That's the first question I want to ask to, Paul Pierson. And the second question to you is that, what happened to the Sunbelt, states like Arizona and Georgia? So why, more voters supported, Biden than we expected compared to 2016 election? So is it, because of incoming, influx of, Latino migrants from the South, or what was working there, giving more votes compared to 2016 to, Democratic candidate? That's the question I want to ask to, Paul Pierson. And the question and comment to Professor Lee is that I'm afraid to think a little bit otherwise than you have reported on racial division. When I saw the NBC exit poll, the result is slightly different from what you have just said in this presentation, which means that the NBC exit poll says that 51%, if we mix race and education, 51% of white college graduates supported Biden, slightly more than 50%. It depends on what you have seen in survey, and it depends on, NBC and CNN, other survey organization. And at the same time, NBC Expo reports that 54% of white women college graduates supported, Joe Biden too. So we mix education and race. The result is slightly different, not, altogether, say no to what you have presented, but slightly different what you gave in this presentation. That's the question I want to ask you.
Thank you, Paul. Do you want to reply to that?
Sure, I'll start. That's a great question. Hard to give a short answer to, but I'll try. I think one way to think about the Democratic coalition, the evolving Democratic coalition, is that the Midwest, what you call the blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, is the past of the Democratic Party, and the Sun Belt is the future of the Democratic Party. So much of that, for the reasons that Taeku was indicating in his comments, the changing racial makeup of the coalition, and which, especially if you look forward in time, is just going to continue. We don't know. It is early days to try to do a fine-grained analysis of the voting. I think it will take some time to have confidence about exactly which groups voted for whom. But my read on Biden in the Midwest was, that he did just enough, though mostly not by recapturing white working class voters, though there was some of that, but mostly by making some gains in the suburbs, some significant gains in the suburbs, and whether Biden gets responsibility for this, probably not, but some improvement again in the race, in the turnout of people of color in urban areas, around urban areas in those states, just enough, right, to swing the balance. I mean, actually, turnout among Democrats in the vote for Biden was substantially higher than it was for Hillary Clinton, but it needed to be because turnout and vote for Donald Trump in these states was also higher than it had been in 2016. My educated guess is that Biden was the right candidate for the party at this moment, that those white suburban gains and at least kind of staunching the slide of white working class voters towards the Republicans were necessary, and that Biden was the best placed to make those kinds of gains. One initial piece of evidence of that is that I think in all these states, Biden ran ahead of congressional Democrats. He got more votes than congressional Democrats did, right? Which suggests that there were voters out there. My guess is that a fair number of them were in the suburbs who voted for Biden at the same time that they did not vote for Democrats for congressional seats. Turning very quickly to the Sun Belt, it is, from the Democrats' perspective, it's a big deal that they carried Arizona and Georgia, if in fact they end up, as seems likely that they're going to carry both those states. They've carried neither of those states. I think the last time they carried Georgia was 1992 or maybe 96. And, they haven't carried Arizona since I don't know when, maybe Taeku knows, but much longer back than that. So, those are indications, I think, of how that electoral environment is changing for Democrats. They now hold all 8 Senate seats in the Southwest, right? If you look at Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, California, those are all Democratic seats. That's an extraordinary change, especially in Arizona. So, I think Democrats can feel pretty good about the gains that they made there, even though, it's a different story if you look at Texas and Florida.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, and Taeku.
Sure. I'd like to give a quick answer to the question that Professor Sohn posed to me, but then I'd also like to say a couple of things about the questions posed to Paul, if I may. So I think I don't disagree. Well, one thing is, if there's a discrepancy in the numbers you're seeing and the numbers I'm seeing with mainstream media exit polls in the U.S., in part, the discrepancy may be due to when you are checking the exit poll results, because part of what they do is they do some post-election reweighting of their results so that their final numbers wind up looking like the actual numbers in the states. It's almost so that they can't be wrong. So they'll do some adjustments afterwards. So that might be part of the difference. But I think the bigger point for me is that you have to really drill down to cuts of demographic groups, down to being able to say white women college graduates, and maybe if you said white women college graduates living in California, you'd get up to 58%. But you really have to, break up the white electorate down to those groups to find a majority that voted for Biden. And the question is, why does it matter so much? Like, why are media pundits so focused on what the white electorate did? And my reading on that is, Biden's sort of campaign slogan was the battle for the soul of America. And I think what he meant by that was the battle for the soul of white America. Because it's clear that for non-white voters for the last 4 years, they've wanted to oust Trump from the White House. And really, the puzzle was what would white voters do in response to having a president who really fanned the flames of white nationalist groups in the United States? And I think the jury is still out because of the way the white vote was split in 2020. I think that battle for the soul of white America is still ongoing. If you look at states like California and New York, I think you'll find that a greater share of white voters voted Democratic than they may have in the past. But if you look at the heartland of America, I think it's gone the other way. I think, and then to your point about the blue wall states and the Sun Belt states, it's hard for me to imagine a candidate that would have done better in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania than Biden did, conditioned on how well Trump did in mobilizing his base in those states in the last couple of weeks, which I think is something that a lot of people, maybe because of a liberal bias in analysts like Paul and I, and maybe some media outlets, we wouldn't have anticipated that level of mobilization from Trump's base in those three states. And given that fact, it's hard to think of another candidate that would have done better than Biden did. And on the Sun Belt, I think you are right that a lot of the story behind what's happened in those states is the story of demographic change. So, to give just one example, Georgia's 7th congressional district, which just flipped from Republican to Democrat and had been a Republican stronghold for decades and decades. In 2004, the Democrats didn't even field a candidate because it was that non-competitive. Since in the last decade, since 2010, that district has gone from being 8% Asian American to almost 16% Asian American, and from being about 12% Latino to more than 22% Latino. And if you add to that the 20-some% who are African American, it's now a majority non-white. And that is the biggest reason why districts like that are changing to the extent that they're changing. So, and you get that sort of effects more broadly across all these Sun Belt states. That's the story of Colorado. It's the story of Nevada. That's the story of New Mexico. That's the story of Arizona.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's pretty much about our first round, which deals with the election per se. And now turn to, I think, actually, here the audience in South Korea more interested in what actually are lying ahead for the Biden presidency. I mean, if he becomes the president, and I mean the question is it really a beginning of the end of Trumpism or Trumpian politics of depolarization, democratic backsliding, racial division, and all other things that Taeku and Paul have mentioned today. And it sounds pessimistic about the future, and also externally, United States is clearly a damaged great power. Trump's unilateralism. Problems with the alliance and partnerships and international institutions in disarray, and the American soft power is really being undercut. So things like that. So whether Biden can, turn around this country in 4 years of his presidency. So that's kind of the question that we want to ask to you. So again, well, this time maybe we start from Taeku first.
Sure, happy to. I think in terms of challenges and difficulties in the road ahead, I think I would start, where I ended my analysis on the election, which is that I think the United States is just deeply divided as a country. I think we are divided by ideological polarization and racial polarization, and those things are set against a backdrop of much weaker social institutions, vanishing social capital, the rise of conspiratorial thinking, pervasive distrust in the institutions that really adjudicate things like facts, like mainstream media, our criminal justice system, science and the academy, and so on. We've lost a lot of what we've had in the past in terms of having a public sphere for the free competition of ideas, which in some sense is sort of the pulse of flourishing democracies, both as an ideal and as a practice. And instead, that loss has been replaced by the exchange of information that's channeled through filter bubbles, political deliberation that is siloed into echo chambers. And this was all true of the U.S. before Donald Trump was elected president, and it has become much, much more true during his presidency, because of his presidency, and for the foreseeable future, I think it will continue to be true in the United States. So electing Joe Biden as our 46th president may have rescued, in the short run, the U.S. from a further descent and further democratic backsliding, but it will likely have little effect in the short term on these sources of erosion into our body politic. So I think the most obvious challenge and difficulty is that President-elect Biden will have to govern in this environment and under these circumstances. And that'll be extremely hard. It'll be especially hard if Trump decides after he leaves office to be something of a professional gadfly who is committed to obstructing anything that Biden tries to do. So that where one side will claim an electoral mandate and try to undo many of Trump's policies, the other side may continue to question the legitimacy of the election results with unsubstantiated allegations of, some specter of electoral fraud. Or to take another example, governing in this environment will also be hard if on the Democratic side or the law and order side, there are prosecutors who investigate and indict President Trump for crimes committed during and prior to his presidency, where one side will see moral high ground in signaling that nobody in America, even an outgoing president, is above the law. The other side will continue to see the dark reach of a deep state that is, hell-bent and single-minded in terms of wanting to prosecute Donald Trump. So on the domestic side, I think it's entirely possible that the new Biden administration will just face constant roadblocks and potholes at every step of the way, trying to enact his legislative agenda. Now, I'd like to believe that there are some consensus issues, or at least issues that somebody of Joe Biden's political skills and personal relationships could build a consensus around, where the president-elect is less likely to face these kinds of daunting challenges, such as executing a coordinated federal response to mitigate and combat the coronavirus pandemic. But I think even there, things are likely to be very, very difficult in the road ahead. And if that's the case, I think Biden faces a further challenge. It's almost a double-edged sword of, on the one hand, facing unwavering opposition from the Republicans and remaining Trump supporters, all the while being unable to deliver the policies that are needed to keep his hard-won coalition of independent centrist Democrats and leftist Democrats behind him to support him. I think there, perhaps the biggest challenges is kind of the time-tested rule of thumb that you have to reward your base. You have to reward the people that put you into office, those core voters most responsible for winning the election for you. And I think for Biden, that core starts with Black voters. And for Black voters, beyond addressing COVID and the economic fallout from COVID, the two top issues in this election were police reform and racial justice. And even in the last week, those issues specifically have already divided the Democratic Party in terms of how poorly the Democratic Party did in Senate races and congressional races. And that just adds to the difficulty, even among Trump's supporters, that he will not be able to deliver on the issues that they voted him for. So is there no possible hope for a successful Biden presidency? Here, I think the future Biden administration could assemble the building blocks to a successful presidency by looking for early wins on two issues that I think might be less likely to be contentious. So the first of these is that I think the country, even many and maybe most Trump supporters, are just frustrated and fed up with how polarized our politics is. And we are hungry for less division and more decency, for less constant chaos and crisis, and more regular, routine, boring, normal politics. I think that the country as a whole is just tired from the last 4 years. And here I think Joe Biden can unilaterally lead by example. If he can successfully not only keep repeating his invocation of being the president for all Americans, including those who didn't vote for him, and then show the skeptics what that means in terms of his initial set of policy priorities, he could potentially flip this otherwise dismal script. The other issue is foreign policy and returning the United States to its once preeminent place as leader of the free world, or at least embracing that as an ambition. And the reason I think that this is a potentially less contentious issue is that I think for most ordinary Americans, and maybe especially for Trump's base, they don't care so deeply about this issue. But I think political elites do, including many of those in the Republican Party who have been deeply unhappy with the instability and the precarity that Trump's sort of seemingly random tweet-driven version of an America First foreign policy has given life to. So I think here, clear, very early, very public signals about America's aspirations and what other nations can expect from the United States as an ally or as an adversary under a Biden administration could go a long way. I think decency as a person and credibility in foreign policy, these are Joe Biden's two strongest suits as a person and as a politician. So his successes on these two fronts could be a foundation for successes elsewhere.
Thank you. So we are actually running out of time. We have about 25 minutes. So let's quickly turn to Paul, your views, and then we get to Q&As. All right.
I'll try to be brief because we do, of course, want to hear people's questions and address those. I'm going to start also with the Republican Party because I think in order to understand what's going to be possible in American politics, one has to start there and the future of Trumpism, if you want to put it that way, because in the American political system, whether you can expect any cooperation from the other party is a decisive question. Especially with as close a balance as we have. And so I'd begin by recalling that when Barack Obama became president with a clear majority, actually 60 seats in the Senate, it's kind of unimaginable now to think that at that point, Democrats were able to win 60 seats in the Senate. The Republican Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, said that his top priority was to make Barack Obama a one-term president, and which was rational for him in many respects. The American political system creates both the incentive for the minority to obstruct and the capacity for the minority to obstruct. And if they can make the president less popular, they win. Right. So just watching just over the last day, we've watched in the U.S., I think, for many people who care about the health of American democracy with great dismay, as Republican elected leaders amplified President Trump's accusations that the election was illegitimate. And that includes Majority Leader McConnell and the leading Republican in the House, Kevin McCarthy. Retired Republicans did not do that, right? So George W. Bush came out with a congratulatory statement. Dan Quayle, who had been H.W. Bush's vice president, came out with a congratulatory statement and said that there was no fraud. And of course, the last presidential candidate on the Republican side, Mitt Romney, also did this. But very, very few elected Republicans have behaved in a way that involved putting democracy and the capacity for the U.S. to govern ahead of Donald Trump and their party. They fanned the flames. And I think this is quite revealing about what we can expect in the days ahead. I don't think it's just that they want to soothe the president's pride, right? I think it's that they believe that they benefit from being able to continue to mobilize their base. They'll benefit in the Georgia runoff elections if they can make their base so angry that they believe that the election has been stolen from them, right? And again, it's completely baseless, right? There is no evidence to support that anything remotely like this happened. And in many ways, it's predictable, completely predictable that President Trump would do this, right? What was slightly less predictable and saddens me, I must say, is that so many elected Republicans would go along because, one, they're terrified of what would happen if they challenged the base with Donald Trump, you know, amping things along, and he's not going to go away unless he goes to jail, which is possible, I think. I think it's quite possible that he will ultimately end up going to jail. But in the meantime, he's going to amp up his base, and he will turn that base against any Republican who supports bipartisanship or just an acknowledgement that Joe Biden legitimately won the election. So this creates an enormous challenge for President Biden. Domestic legislation, I think, and most is going to be extraordinarily difficult. It will be because it will require the agreement of Republicans in the Senate, and they have strong incentives to withhold that agreement to make the president look bad. So that will be extremely difficult. There are some things that a president can do through executive action. You know, many of Trump's executive orders can be reversed on the first day. The United States will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, for example. The Muslim ban, immigration ban, will be repealed by executive order. But even there, a president, their ability to act unilaterally is going to be limited by a Republican-dominated Supreme Court, an increasingly ideologically conservative Supreme Court, which is likely to be much more critical in its views of executive power when that executive power is wielded by Joe Biden instead of Donald Trump. The one place where a president is likely to have considerable room to maneuver is in foreign policy. Their presidents can do a lot unilaterally, and they're less subject to scrutiny from either Congress or from the courts. The challenge there, which Taeku is already alluding to, I think, is Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden does have a lot of credibility among countries that have traditionally been allies with the United States. But I think those allies are going to have to ask themselves, as the Trump experience has shown, how much can we rely on the credibility of the United States? Right? We may be able to rely on the honesty and accept the interest and cooperation that comes from the person who is currently the leader. But do we believe that he can credibly commit to things that we can expect the United States to follow through on 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And building an alliance in the absence of that kind of confidence is extraordinarily difficult, even without all the other challenges that the international community faces.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I think it's almost a consensus between you and Taeku. It's really a doom and gloom projection of the Biden administration for the next 4 years. But one bright side is foreign policy. You can obviously go over the partisan politics. So I think I have a long list of questions from the audience, and actually most of them are foreign policy issues. I know Paul and Taegu do not squarely work on foreign policy, American foreign policy, but I mean, you can, I mean, the audience really want to hear from you. So there are several questions. I think we have to do this first, and then if time remains, go back to Byoung for further questions to you and comments as well. I think the U.S. policy toward Korea, alliance issue, and also what would be the new administration's North Korean policy. These two questions are most frequent questions that I have. So if you want to, who's going to go first on Biden's foreign policy toward Korean Peninsula?
Taeku, I'm guessing you're probably in a better position to talk about that.
Well, I think a lot will depend on first who Biden picks for his transition team, and then who he winds up picking for important cabinet positions. But I think the default would be to assume that it will be more like the U.S. approach to foreign policy vis-a-vis both South Korea and North Korea that characterized the Obama years, and possibly also the Clinton years than what we've seen over the last 4 years. I think at the same time, I think there has been substantial momentum towards thawing North Korea's relations with South Korea and with the United States. That might be an opportunity to do something slightly different. But I think I would say my default hypothesis would be that it would be very much in line with the Obama presidency's view towards South Korea as an ally.
I got the question. It's about Kamala Harris. What would be her role as a vice president in the upcoming, in the government, and what type of issues will she take care of? And also how popular she is in the nationwide. Yes.
Yeah, I think we don't know yet. I assume that she would be. It won't be a situation like with Obama and Biden, where I think Biden devoted a lot of his energies towards foreign policy, while the president, at least initially, focused on the domestic agenda. I mean, I think Biden had tremendous experience in foreign policy, and I think Harris's strengths are more on the domestic side initially. And of course, there's a challenge there because, the domestic agenda is going to be really, really constrained unless the Georgia Senate race turns out differently than we think that it is likely to do. I mean, I think one thing to keep an eye on, and in addition to Vice President Harris, her background as a prosecutor and as Attorney General in California, who Biden chooses as his Attorney General is going to be quite significant, I think, because we're nearing the end of the most corrupt administration in American history. I think we know that even before there's more sustained investigation of it. Obviously, in a deeply polarized country, it is going to be really challenging to figure out how the administration wants to handle that, how they want to do it in such a way that criminality and corruption is punished rather than rewarded, but that it doesn't seem like some kind of vendetta. And so I think Harris's advice on that would probably play a really important role in the administration, given her experience. And of course, the other thing is she is, in many ways, she embodies the party's future for the reasons that Taeku was talking about before. And I think that her role in outreach, communication, mobilization to younger voters and to people of color in the U.S., that's going to be important part. How that's going to be connected to policy is less clear to me, but I think that's going to be a really important part of her role.
Question one.
Can I really quickly just add to what Paul said? I'll go out on a limb and make a prediction about Kamala Harris's initial role, which is there are two really important areas where I think President Biden will have to show a demonstrated interest, even if he can't make any progress in terms of legislation or policy. And those are criminal justice reform and reform to our electoral system in terms of voting rights and so on. And so I would predict that President Biden will set up some sort of presidential initiative to investigate those issues more deeply until he can pull more political capital together to try to do something legislatively. And Kamala Harris is the natural person to lead those initiatives. The one other thing I'll say really quickly is I'm a lot more, well, I don't know if I'm a lot more optimistic. I'm a lot less pessimistic than Paul is about our ability to win the 2 Georgia Senate races.
Okay. So here's a question. What are the most, 2, 3 pressing problems that President-elect Biden will face between now and his inauguration?
Between now and the inauguration?
Yes.
So I just want to, just quickly following up on Taeku's comment. I'm pessimistic about Georgia in the sense that I think it's less likely that they win than that they lose. But maybe you're more optimistic than that. It is worth underscoring that the foreign observers are going to want to really watch those races. Because as I tried to emphasize at the beginning, were Democrats to win those races, we would be in a very different world. Now, 50-50 with the vice president breaking a tie is still not great. And I read just before we started this program, I read that Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, had announced that he would not support the elimination of the filibuster in the Senate, right? The rule which allows a minority of 41 to block, that he would not support a reform to that, even if Democrats won those 2 seats in Georgia. So that basically, that takes filibuster reform off the table, and that's a big deal. At least initially it takes it off the table. But you would be able to do some very significant things. And I see they've been signposting what the main things that they want to focus on, right? Which is, so I don't think there's any question about what their priority, where they see the problems. The pandemic is job one. Because I think they realize that without a better plan for dealing with the pandemic, they will not be able to get the economy going again. And there's a place where the administration actually has some autonomy, right? So, and he can do a lot in the next couple of months to get ready. They've already got a team in place that was announced today. So that's one. Economic reform, economic recovery. Following from that, they're going to need more help from Congress. Racial justice. Taeku was just talking about some things that could be initiated that they'll get going on right away so that they can hit the ground going. And the last is climate change. And there again, there are things that a president can do even without the cooperation of Congress. The Environmental Protection Agency is a powerful agency. They can pursue significant policies having to do with climate change. The challenge there, though, is that the Supreme Court is looming. And I think it is not difficult to imagine a scenario in which, following in Obama's footsteps, a Biden administration crafts and implements ambitious regulations with respect to climate change, only to see them gutted or struck down in a couple of years by a conservative Supreme Court.
Thank you. Yeah, we have some time left. So, Professor Sohn, do you have questions and comments? You're muted. Unmute, please.
Okay, I have several very quick questions, and any one of you can answer my question. The first one is that, some Republican readers, including, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, is very reluctant to say congratulations to President-elect Joe Biden. Is it because he really, really believes that this election is fraud, or is it because he's fearful of President Donald Trump's response or revenge? That's my first question. And the second question is that this is a question from me, not necessarily as a professor, but one of the Korean citizens. I'm very curious about that. What would be the future role of Donald Trump once he's out of office? He will become a second, Sarah Palin, just saying, lots of things for a Republican Party and just fizzle away, or his, stature will last several years from now. And finally, the other thing is that, is there any possibility that, Joe Biden would broaden his support beyond those who voted for him by successfully coping with, COVID, pandemic situation? That's my question.
Great.
Those are great questions. Do you want me to take a step, or do you want to go first?
Well, let me just talk about McConnell. Let me do McConnell real quickly, and let you take the other two. They are great questions. I think it has less to do with fear of Donald Trump than it has to do with fear of Trumpism, and also recognizing that he gains an advantage from angering the base, right? And I think in many ways is actually something, this was a central part of the argument that Jacob Hacker and I made in this book, Let Them Eat Tweets, is that the Republican Party over a long period of time, well before Donald Trump arrived, had found that allying with groups who could mobilize outrage, much of it linked to racial resentment, was a way to stoke political support among those who were receiving nothing from Republican economic policies. But the problem is, or a big part of it, there's a kind of Frankenstein's monster element to this, right? Which is that once you've created this outrage machine, you can't really control it anymore. And of course, conservative media, Fox News, and so on, is a big part of this. And so I think Mitch McConnell could quite reasonably think that not supporting these baseless accusations of an illegitimate election would fracture the party, would lead to fury on the right wing of the party in a way that actually would potentially cost Republicans the elections in Georgia. Right. So, so again, as they have so many times in the past, and in a way that is, I think, deeply damaging to our political system, they have chosen to amplify things in the pursuit of narrow, immediate interest, even though it's very costly for our political system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Taeku?
Sure. I mean, I would add to what Paul said. One thing about McConnell and and the Republican Party in power today, which is that it is unrecognizable from the Republican Party pre-Newt Gingrich 1994. And really what's happened to one of the two major parties in a global superpower is that a sort of extremist fringe element of the Republican Party, all the way from the extreme right, over about a decade period, has essentially occupied the center of the Republican Party. You know, McConnell is affiliated with the Tea Party movement. So was Mark Meadows. So was Mick Mulvaney. So are all these people who are currently viewed as the top brass, the top leadership of the Republican Party. And I have a quote here that I want to read from John Boehner, who was summarily ousted from his role as House Majority Leader when he was at the head of Republicans in Congress. Boehner said of the Tea Party, "They can't tell you what they're for. They can tell you everything that they're against. They're anarchists. They want total chaos, tear it all down and start over. That's where their mindset is." And if that's true and that's what's occupied the center of the Republican Party, nobody should expect responsible party behavior from Republican Party leaders denouncing the actions of Trump or declaring the election to be legitimate, because Trump is the perfect vessel for their political ambitions. In terms of what Trump does in the future, I think it's really, I mean, it's hard to tell, but I think one thing, to be fair to Trump, the person, if I can actually say those words, is I think it's too easy to think of Trump as this sort of monstrous political outsider who came in and destroyed all our social and political institutions. I think the country was ready for somebody like that. And once Trump stepped into that role, it becomes endogenous. I think he's really fed off of the kind of adulation, almost cult-like adulation he's gotten from his base. And that becomes like a drug. I think the more of it, I mean, if you just think about the fact that his first plan in response to challenging the election beyond, you know, setting his lawyers off to Michigan and Pennsylvania and so on, is to have another big rally. So I think, you know, whatever Trump does, I think he's going to have to continue to feed that need, which if I can very quickly pivot to say why I'm more optimistic about Georgia. I think the question you have to ask about Georgia is, will Trump basically be able to look beyond his own political interests or his own personal interests and do some campaigning in Georgia for the good of the party? I don't think he can. I don't think he will. I think he will be too much wallowing in his defeat in the 2020 election. And if that is the case, I don't think the Republican Party turnout in Georgia is going to be anything like the Democratic Party turnout in Georgia, which is why I think that there are reasons to be optimistic about those two Senate races.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, yeah, we are on time. So exactly on time. So I will have to finish now. I don't think I need any further concluding remarks summarizing, you know, today's seminar, because it really is a great seminar. This time again, thank you so much for you know, Paul, Taeku, and Byoung. It's again extremely interesting and intriguing and enlightening. You know, time for me and EAI and the audience. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm thinking of inviting you again if 2 years, 4 years, who never knows. So once again, thank you so much. And I think it's the end of the seminar.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so
Hope
much.
to see you again and stay healthy.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Bye-bye.